You may have heard before that vitamin D can actually be synthesized inside of your skin cells, but how on earth do you get from a molecule which I'm going to talk about in a second to vitamin D known as calcitrol, and what role do things like photons and UV rays, as well as a few other things, actually play inside of this process? But first, subscribe and stick around to the end to find out. Now I'm going to bring it back to the first ever sciencey sort of base video that I ever made on the production and synthesis of cholesterol from acetyl coenzyme A. One of the precursors to cholesterol inside of this process, known as 7-dehydrocholesterol, is the starter molecule for this reaction. But 7-dehydrocholesterol can absorb UV rays and photons in the wavelengths of 290 to 315 nanometers, and this is essentially energy. It absorbs this energy, and this energy will allow it to transform into an entirely different molecule. Now, if you look at the molecule of 7-dehydrocholesterol to vitamin D, active form of vitamin D, calcitrol, they have a slightly similar structures. You can see the sort of tail end is pretty similar with a few hydroxyl groups added on, and you've got like this little bit here with the rings, then you've got this ring which is like kind of the same. But how on earth does this get to this? And this is because 7-dehydrocholesterol, when sunlight actually acts on it, it ends up turning to something known as pre-cholecalciferol or pre-vitamin D3, and this opens up the B ring. It means that a few double bonds are created. The top half of the molecule is still the same, and the A ring is also exactly the same. Doesn't really affect too much about the chemical structure of the molecule, but that is basically the light-dependent, UV ray-dependent stage of vitamin D production completely done. Now, pre-Vit D3 is a very unstable molecule. Not exactly sure why, but body heat is enough to sort of mean that this molecule can turn into something else known as cholecalciferol, normal vitamin D3, and that, while it doesn't have actually any effects on the body whatsoever, that can then be turned into calcitriol in a few other metabolic processes that I will talk about later down the line. This cholecalciferol will then be taken out of your cells. It will bind to vitamin D3 binding proteins because vitamin D is a fat-soluble chemical. Not sure if vitamin D3 specifically is fat-soluble. I'm pretty sure all the D vitamins are fat-soluble. Hopefully cholecalciferol isn't an exception, but it does bind to vitamin D3 specific proteins. It will be taken to the liver where it will be turned into calcidiol, also known as 25-hydroxy-cholecalciferol by the enzyme 25-hydroxylase. Now, what's funny is calcidiol is the sort of main name for this molecule. That's because of the presence of now two hydroxyl groups. Cholecalciferol is just a normal molecule, but then when you get calcidiol, you get the di because di means two. That means two hydroxyl groups, and you get this calcidiol that will still probably be fat soluble. It will then bind to this specific protein that will then transport to the kidneys, and the kidneys will then turn calcidiol into calcitriol using the enzyme 1-alpha hydroxylase. Now, calcitriol is a literal hormone. This is the active form of vitamin D. This is the form that supplements, etc., will eventually turn into once it gets digested and metabolized by the processes that we have just talked about. And calcitriol, that is when vitamin D can do its thing. And I'm going to go through a few of the effects it has specifically on calcium regulation and absorption, which is one of the main reasons that vitamin D is classed as a vitamin, because it has such a vital process, it has such a vital role in this process. Not only does vitamin D help regulate calcium levels inside of the bloodstream, it also helps its absorption. It also helps the gene expression of certain calcium binding proteins known as carbindin D9K and carbindin D28K. It also has a role in the protein synthesis of certain carrier molecules which carry it across the cell membranes to it from the gut lining into the bloodstream, and these are known as TRPV6 and PMCA16. Now, I've mentioned the kidney before, and the kidney has a very interesting function because what the kidney does, the way the kidney gets rid of water from the body, urea from the body, all that sort of stuff, is when the blood goes through the kidney, it will diffuse out into things, I think they're called nephrons. Stuff will diffuse, things like glucose will diffuse, things like urea will diffuse when being dissolved in water, and all that sort of stuff will happen. Things like proteins are far too big to sort of dissolve and be excreted in this way. But things like calcitriol, things like calcium, aren't very, very small things. Probably one of the smallest things possible that could be found inside of your bloodstream at any given time. These are very, very easily excreted, and vitamin D helps stop this. It helps stop the absorption of calcium out of the bloodstream in the first place, but also when all this stuff is diffused and osmosed out of this initial bloodstream, it is either then goes into the bladder where you will excrete it, or it can be reabsorbed back into the bloodstream later down the line. It also helps the reabsorption of calcium that did initially escape into this sort of nephron, and that means that your calcium blood levels are regulated. Vitamin D calcitriol as a hormone has a negative feedback loop to help when calcium levels are low. Parathyroid hormone will help turn calcidiol into calcitriol inside of the kidneys. If calcium levels are low, that's what will happen, because more calcitriol is clearly needed to regulate calcium reabsorption into the kidneys as well as absorption from the gut. This will mean that calcium levels return back to normal. Obviously, if they go too high in the bloodstream, as that can potentially happen, parathyroid hormone will be not released whatsoever, and this means that less calcitriol will be produced so that it can return back to normal. This negative feedback loop is constantly going up and down and up and down and up and down, trying to find a very fine balance, as what commonly happens inside of your body. Your body needs a very fine balance for a lot of things, and calcium levels, as well as so many other things, are one of them. But that's about all I have for this video. That is how vitamin D calcitriol is synthesized inside of your body from UV light. A bit similar to how photosynthesis works, with water and carbon dioxide turning into glucose and oxygen, with being a light dependent reaction, except your skin, your hands, your face doesn't really have chloroplasts, so it's kind of a similar thing, but not exactly similar. While the turning from 7-dehydrocholesterol to pre-cholecalciferol is a photon-dependent and light-dependent reaction, it doesn't really have exactly the same mechanisms as photosynthesis, because photosynthesis is probably a lot more complicated than that one simple step reaction, and I'll probably go through why that is in the future. But with that, I hope you enjoyed, and I recommend subscribing, because I love this community of young tribal people who are willing to improve themselves so much more than they already have, and good luck.